Today's video is going to be a little bit different than usual. I caught a bad case of the flu last week, so we've been pretty behind schedule. As a result, I'm still working on the script for our newest case. That being said, because I'm feeling a little bit better now and we didn't want to leave you all hanging, we decided to put a little something together that we hope you'll enjoy. Today, we're going to be covering 3 true crime stories centered around a single theme. Just a heads up, while these are from older videos, we've never done any of these cases on camera previously, and all of them have been completely re-edited. As for today's theme, well, it's a twist on a classic urban legend catchphrase. It's, "The monster was coming from inside the house." As always, my name is Nigel. I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. Also, let us know what you thought of this special compilation in the comment section below. With that out of the way, let's dive in. At the start of 2018, 27-year-old Laura Sugden and 30-year-old Shane Gilmer were excited about their future together. They had been dating for 2 years, and now that Laura was several months pregnant with their first child, they were thinking about getting married. However, less than 2 weeks into the new year, the dreams of the madly in love couple would be forever destroyed when ongoing problems with a neighbor escalated into violent tragedy. Laura and Shane met while working as housing officers for the East Riding Council in Yorkshire, England. Shane was particularly passionate about his job there, and according to both his colleagues and supervisors, worked tirelessly to help people who were homeless or in need of accommodation find their own places. The fact that Shane and Laura were both colleagues and romantic partners meant that they rarely spent time apart. It was the kind of situation that could have caused tension for the wrong people, but for them it worked really well. Laura would later say that the honeymoon period in the relationship never went away. Soon the couple had started living together as well, when Shane moved in with Laura and her daughter from a previous relationship into the semi-detached cottage property Laura rented in Southburn. Southburn is a tiny town in Yorkshire, just a few miles away from Driffield and not too far from the northeast coast of England. The sleepy town consists of about 20 homes and not much else, surrounded by farmland. It's mostly devoid even of the small pubs and shops that are characteristic of small English towns. Because of the wide open spaces, you wouldn't think that Southburn would be the kind of place where you would have to worry about bad neighbors, and for the most part, you'd be right. But Laura and Shane's situation was sort of unique. Because they lived in a semi-detached cottage, they did have one neighbor living in their immediate vicinity, a 55-year-old man named Anthony Lawrence. When Laura began renting the cottage in 2014, Anthony was already there. He mostly kept to himself and had a reputation as a loner amongst the local residents. When Laura first moved in, she kind of felt sorry for Anthony. It seemed like he spent most of his time cooped up inside, rarely venturing out for more than an hour at a time. He wasn't chatty, but he wasn't exactly unfriendly towards her either. The only conversation he had seemed genuinely interested in had been when he had asked her about how much rent she was paying, presumably to figure out if he was being overcharged. However, by the time that Shane moved in, Anthony had become a bit of a persistent nuisance. In particular, he liked to play loud music late into the night, which was audible through their shared wall. Wanting to avoid any sort of conflict, the couple avoided saying anything to Anthony unless they really had to, like in situations where it was preventing them and Laura's young daughter Isabel from sleeping. Still, no matter how polite they were, or how many times they told Anthony to just not play music past a certain time, the incidents kept happening with increasing frequency. Things got even worse when Shane and Laura began to notice an extremely strong odor of marijuana in Isabel's room that seemed to be seeping through the walls. The odor was far too powerful to just be the result of Anthony smoking inside, and the pair began to suspect that their next-door neighbor was actively running a grow operation out of his apartment. Laura was especially concerned because of Isabel's asthma, which she would later say was being agitated by the fumes. In January of 2017, things escalated significantly between the neighbors when one night Shane went over to Anthony's house to tell him to turn his music down. They'd already had a conversation about the music earlier in the evening, But again, not wanting to escalate things, Shane and Laura had decided not to say anything to Anthony again until they were actually ready to go to bed. Shane tapped on the window of Anthony's apartment, and he motioned him to the back door. Thinking nothing of it, Shane walked around, only to be confronted by Anthony holding an axe. He was completely irate and proceeded to launch into a tirade of threats against Shane and Laura, cursing at them and saying he was going to kill them. Though Anthony never actually tried to attack either of them with the axe, it was enough for Shane to call the police. While it's doubtful that police would have been able to do much anyway, given the lack of evidence, amazingly, when Shane made the report, he again attempted to avoid conflict with Anthony, stressing to officers that he didn't want to take further action, but he wanted the incident to be on record in case anything else happened. Eventually, Shane and Laura did contact the police about their suspicions that Anthony was growing marijuana in his house, but they were told that this was not enough to be able to legally search the property. Increasingly concerned about her daughter's asthma, Laura instead decided to take their complaint to the agent in charge of managing the cottage property for their landlord. The agent arranged a visit to the house, and though she found no hard evidence of a grow-op in Anthony's apartment, she did notice that the room that shared a wall with Isabel's room had a particularly pungent odor to it. It seemed like someone had tried to cover the smell with powerful cleaning chemicals. The visit was enough for the agent to arrange for Anthony to be evicted from the property, and he received a notice in December of 2017. In order to protect Shane and Laura from any potential hostility, Anthony was told that his rental agreement was not being renewed for 2018 because they needed to do renovations on the cottage. Unfortunately, what nobody knew was that Anthony was well aware of Shane and Laura's role in his eviction. He had purchased a listening device more than a year earlier and had spent the past few months spying on the couple through their shared wall. Ahead of Anthony's move-out date, there were no real open hostilities between the neighbors, but Shane and Laura found horse manure in their garden and on their driveway on 2 separate occasions. Whether they made the connection that Anthony was responsible or not is unclear, but if they did, they chose not to address it with him directly. After all, they figured they would be rid of Anthony in just a few short weeks. Everything seemed fine until the night of January 12th, 2018. That Friday evening, Shane and Laura had the house to themselves, and they decided to go out for a date night at an Italian restaurant in Hull, about a 30-minute drive away. The couple returned home from their romantic dinner just after 9 p.m. and planned to spend the rest of that night relaxing and watching TV. However, when Laura went upstairs, she noticed something strange. There was a mark on the cream carpet flooring, but she knew that neither she nor Shane had tracked dirt into the house. The mark was just below the hatch leading up to the attic. Feeling uneasy, Laura first went into her and Shane's bedroom, before coming out and going to check her daughter's room as well. As she slowly pushed the door open, she came face to face with Anthony Lawrence, who was holding a crossbow. Anthony quickly forced Laura back into the bedroom, and she began screaming. The terrifying commotion caused Shane to run upstairs to see what was wrong. But before he could even really react to the situation, Anthony shot Shane with one of the bolts from the crossbow, which went through his arm, continuing through his body until it lodged in his spinal column. The horrifying injury caused Shane to become incapacitated, at which point Anthony returned to the room where Laura was. At this point, Laura was pleading with Anthony, begging him not to hurt her and saying that she was pregnant. But that's when Anthony started screaming at her that he had been listening to her and Shane, and that he knew that they were the ones that had gotten him evicted. Laura said that she would call both the landlord and the police and tell them that they had made everything up, but Anthony continued the attack. He shot Laura with another bolt in the top of her head. Laura managed to pull the bolt out while Anthony tried to reload and proceeded to try and attack him with it. In the ensuing struggle, Anthony managed to get the bolt away from Laura and used it to further attack her in the neck and throat. After that, Anthony disappeared. Laura ran to help Shane, but he was worried that Anthony was still in the house. He insisted that Laura needed to get out, both to find help for herself and the baby. Despite her injuries, she managed to run more than 200 meters to the next closest house, where she was given first aid and police and emergency service workers were called. At the same time that this was happening, Shane managed to drag himself to the nearest phone and also called police. In excruciating pain and knowing that he was quickly fading, Shane explained to authorities everything he could about what had happened and told them to tell his family that he loved them. Terrified that Anthony had managed to find Laura as she ran for help, he also continued to insist that they find her before coming to help him. Due to both the remote location of the house and the fact that Anthony could still be armed and dangerous in the area, it took help several minutes longer than usual to arrive to tend to Shane. By that time, his condition was extremely dire, though he was able to remain conscious long enough to be told that Laura was safe and had been taken to the hospital. Sadly, Shane went into cardiac arrest not long after arriving at the hospital himself, and he died the next morning. But Laura's life and the life of her unborn baby were able to be saved. For the next 2 days, the normally quiet town of Southburn was swarming with police and canine units as authorities worked to track down Anthony Lawrence. The town remained locked down until the morning of January 14th, when Anthony's body was found inside of a camper van in a remote area of northern Yorkshire. He had died of a fatal overdose of painkillers. Though the tragic case received widespread coverage in the UK at the time it took place, it would take more than 3 years for many of the details of the crime to be released to the public, when an inquest was held in April of 2021. Aside from the revelation of the listening device that Anthony had used to spy on Laura and Shane for months leading up to the attack, perhaps the most chilling detail to be released was how he had managed to get into their house undetected. Anthony had removed bricks from the shared wall in their attic, making a hole large enough so that he could crawl through. On the night of the attack, he had gone through the hole and had laid in wait until they came home. That being said, these were far from the only details that showed the considerable forethought that Anthony had put into the brutal crime. He had rented the camper van that he was eventually found in several days before the attack, and was seen burning unknown paperwork in a metal bin outside of the cottage. He also tampered with the bolts he used in the attack to make them more lethal, though sources do not specify exactly how he did this. Anthony also told his sister that he would be going to Thailand and asked her to take care of his dog, though there's no evidence that he ever bought a plane ticket. The inquest ultimately decided that Shane had been killed unlawfully, and that if Anthony were still alive, he would have been charged with murder and attempted murder. Following the inquest, Laura Sugden called for greater regulations on crossbows, saying that there needed to be systems in place to stop twisted and dangerous individuals like Anthony from getting their hands on them. Laura and Shane's daughter Ella was born in August of 2018, with the most recent reports we could find saying that she is healthy and happy. Laura says that she is still in love with Shane and traumatized by what happened, but that their daughter has helped to heal her heart somewhat in the years since. At approximately 6 p.m. on the evening of October 17th, 1941, a woman in Denver, Colorado, named Jenny Ross, told her family that she was going to check on their neighbor, Philip Peters. The 73-year-old retiree had been living alone at his house across the street for several weeks, after his wife Helen had taken a nasty fall the previous month and broken her hip. Like several others in the neighborhood, Jenny and her family had offered to help Philip out with a few things while Helen was in the hospital, giving him extra time to make his daily visits there. This included providing daily breakfasts and dinners for Philip, for which he always showed up very promptly. On this particular evening, however, dinner was ready, but there was no sign of Philip anywhere. When Jenny walked across the street to Philip's front door, her concern only deepened when she discovered that there were no lights on inside the house. Though her repeated knocks at the door went unanswered, she noticed what she believed were Philip's hat and cane in the hallway. At this point, she decided to alert a few other neighbors to what was going on. After a few people gathered outside the Peters home, they figured that they would try to see if they could get inside. The front door was locked, so the group decided that they would try to gain access through the rear of the house. A woman named Doris Burke was lifted over the wall of the home's screened-in back porch and was eventually able to get in. When Doris entered and turned on the light in the kitchen, those outside heard 2 terrified screams. They would soon learn why. Upon turning on the lights, Doris discovered blood on the kitchen floor and in various places on the ground level of the house. In the front bedroom, lying next to a bed, was the lifeless body of Philip Peters. Following the chilling discovery, the neighbors called the police, who quickly arrived on the scene. The investigation was led by Captain James Childers, who would later tell the media several of the observations he and his detectives made during the initial days and weeks of the investigation. An analysis of the crime scene showed that Philip Peters had died from repeated blunt force injuries to the head. It was believed that the primary weapon used in the murder had been a heavy iron stove shaker handle, a device that is normally used to shake the grates of a traditional stove while burning coal to make sure the ashes get to the bottom of the pan and ensure a complete burn. It appeared that the stove shaker had been wiped of blood and fingerprints, but a small amount of blood was still found on the shaker when it was examined at a lab. Investigators determined that a second weapon, likely some kind of older revolver, had also been used in the attack, as pieces of what appeared to be a handle were found scattered around the crime scene. The whole bottom floor of the house was in disarray, suggesting that a serious struggle had taken place between Philip and his attacker. Defensive wounds to Philip's arms, as well as one of his broken canes found at the scene, further showed that he had fought back hard against the killer. As police considered all of the evidence, they arrived at two main theories of the case: that Philip was murdered during a robbery, or that he was murdered for some kind of revenge. The latter scenario seemed to make no sense to anyone who actually knew Philip or Helen Peters. Not only did the couple not have any known enemies, but Philip in particular was known as a kind and friendly person who was well liked by his neighbors. The 73-year-old had worked nearly his entire professional life for the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, eventually advancing to the position of auditor before retiring in 1930. For many years in his free time, Philip had been involved in a local club of Denver musicians for mandolin and guitar players. He had been well liked there, too, playing the mandolin and helping to organize small shows and concerts across Denver. He and Helen had lived in their Moncrief Place house for the past 40 years, and their only child, Philip Jr., had long since married and moved roughly 250 miles away to Grand Junction. This left robbery as the most likely motive behind the crime. However, here too, investigators soon found themselves at a dead end. It appeared that nothing of significant value was missing from the Peters home. Additionally, aside from the way that the neighbors had managed to force their way into the house, all of the other doors or windows to the residence appeared to be locked. So it wasn't even clear how a potential burglar could have gotten in and out. Little did anyone know, though, the truth about what had happened to Philip Peters was far more strange and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. While months soon passed with no new leads in the investigation, authorities remained determined to solve the case. Any police patrol cars traveling through the area were instructed to keep a close eye on the Peters property, and occasionally detectives would return to the house to see if there was something that they had overlooked. However, they consistently failed to find anything of interest. In February of 1942, Helen Peters was released from the hospital and briefly moved back into her home, though returned to the hospital only a few weeks later after injuring her hip for a second time. She would come back to her house once again at the end of April, but by this point was mostly bedridden and confined to the second floor of the house. As a result, she required nearly around-the-clock care. Weirdly, though, Helen soon found it exceedingly difficult to keep steady caretakers and housekeepers employed at the house. Many would quit after only a few days, complaining of strange noises at night, including what sounded like footsteps. Many, like the housekeeper Hattie Johnson, concluded that the Peters place was haunted and refused to return. Another woman named Edith Clark called police after seeing what she believed was a bony white hand reaching around an open door, followed by the sounds of fleeing footsteps. Like each time before, searches of the house revealed nothing, though. 2 officers were even stationed in the Peters home for 2 days and nights following Edith Clark's chilling account, but they too failed to notice anything out of the ordinary. For her part, it appears that Helen Peters never heard any of the weird noises or witnessed any of the strange sights that her caretakers did. Some reports that we read mentioned that she was hard of hearing, though it was said that she believed that the people that worked for her simply suffered from overactive imaginations, likely brought on by the knowledge of the grisly crime that had taken place in the house. Still, Unable to find reliable help, and with her health continuing to decline, Helen eventually agreed to stay with her son and daughter-in-law in Grand Junction. And in mid-July of that year, she left her home for the final time. Though the Peters house now stood vacant, this didn't stop the police from receiving eerie reports about so-called unexplained happenings there. Neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. John Voss, told police that some of the window blinds had changed position after Helen had left. Others reported seeing strange lights and mysterious shadows inside the home during the night. This only added to the fears of locals that the house was haunted, leading to rumors about the so-called Moncrief ghost. Then came the night of July 30th, 1942. It was a particularly warm night in Denver, and two of the detectives that had been working on the Philip Peters murder investigation, Roy Bloxam and William Jackson, decided to check in on the house. It's important to note that reports differ slightly here. Some say the detectives broke down the front door after witnessing a curtain move, while others say that they were always going to enter the property and instead became concerned when they heard what they thought was a faint sound of a door locking at the top of the stairs after they were already inside. Regardless, what appears to be agreed on by everyone is that once inside the house, the detectives followed sounds they heard coming from the second floor, quickly drawing them into a room that was being used to store old furniture, newspapers, and magazines. They opened up a closet in the room just in time to see a person's legs desperately scrambling up into a tiny hole in the ceiling. They grabbed the legs and pulled, causing an unknown man to fall down and back into the closet. The man was dressed in tattered clothes and appeared to be on the verge of starvation. While nearly 6 feet tall, he was pale and emaciated, to the point where he was severely underweight. His exact weight is another area where reports contradict each other, but estimates range from a little over 100 pounds on the high end to just 75 on the low end. The man's smell was also apparently unbearable. An examination of the hole the man was trying to climb into presented a further series of shocking revelations. Barely 8 inches wide and 15 inches long, the tiny concealed hole led to a similarly cramped attic space above the Peters' second-floor bedroom. The space was 4 feet wide and 12 feet long, and reached just 3 feet tall at its highest point. Inside, investigators discovered a pile of torn and tattered blankets on top of piles of newspaper that had been crafted into a bed. Cans of tomatoes, empty jars, bits of wire, and containers of human waste lined the hidden compartment. A radio set, a light, and an old toaster that had been converted into a makeshift hot plate were also recovered. Interestingly, so was an old revolver, the same one that was believed to have been used in Philip's murder. It was clear that whoever this man was, he had been living here for some time. But it wouldn't be until police questioned him that the full extent of the horrifying situation would come to light. Though the man initially told police that his name was Matthew Cornish, after he was allowed to clean himself and was given some food, he revealed his true identity, 59-year-old Theodore Edward Coneys. In an 8,000-word statement given to police on the night of July 31st, he confessed how he had come to be living in the nightmarish space in the Peters' home, and how he had been responsible for Philip's death. It turned out that Coneys was no stranger to the Peters. In fact, at one point in time, they had been friendly with one another. Coneys had met Philip as a young man after moving to Denver from Illinois. A sickly child, he had never been expected to live past the age of 18, and had supposedly moved to Denver sometime between 1907 and 1910 with his mother, partly for his health. Reports, again, contradict each other on how Coneys and Philip met, but most say that they became friendly while they were both involved in the mandolin and guitar club. In fact, Coneys told police that he had been over to Philip and Helen's house several times as a young man, before leaving Denver in 1917. After the failure of his advertising business and unable to get into the army because of his poor health, Coneys had spent more than 20 years wandering across the United States, never finding much success. In April of 1941, Coneys once again found himself in Denver, and by this time, his situation was as bad as it had ever been. He stayed in low-cost housing when he could afford it, but mostly he was homeless. By September, Coneys told police that he was so desperate, he planned to go to the Peters' house and ask them for some money or a meal, despite the fact that it had been well over 20 years since they had last seen each other. However, his plan abruptly changed when he got to the property and saw Philip leaving with a suitcase on his way to visit his wife in the hospital. From an alleyway, Coneys noticed that Philip had left the back door unlocked and seized his opportunity. Once Philip was gone, Coneys entered the house and immediately took what food he could from the Peters' icebox. He then proceeded to walk around and investigate until, by chance, he stumbled across that small trap door in the upstairs closet. The space had no insulation, was completely unventilated, and was tiny, but still, Coneys concluded that it would be far better to stay there than to try and spend the upcoming Colorado winter out on the street. For 5 weeks, Coneys had stayed hidden in his makeshift attic home, initially only daring to come out at night when he could hear Philip snoring in bed. During this time, Coneys said he survived by taking what little food he could without being noticed, all the while trying to find money that he believed Philip had hidden around the house. Then, on October 17th, Coneys pushed his luck too far. Choosing to venture out of his hiding place when he believed Philip wasn't home, he was in the middle of stealing food from the icebox when Philip suddenly sprang up from a nearby couch. Coneys told police that Philip did not recognize him and said that he was going to call the police. In a panic, he grabbed an old revolver off the wall and began to hit Philip with it. As the struggle between the two men continued through various rooms on the first floor, Coneys said that he eventually switched to the stove shaker, which proved to be far more lethal. After the murder, he cleaned the weapon, grabbed what food he could, and returned to his hiding place, not daring to move a muscle for quite some time. Chillingly, Coneys told detectives that throughout the time that the home was occupied, he had routinely come down from his hiding place during the night to search for the Peters' money, often standing in their bedroom as they slept. He continued to look for the money even after he had murdered Philip, but he never found it. Apparently, the stashes were later recovered by police and given to Helen. Though he ultimately managed to remain concealed in the Peters' home for 10 months. As time went on, Coneys said his existence in the attic became more and more hellish. Despite his fears of getting caught, the periods when Helen lived in the home were actually better for him because it meant there was food there for him to steal when he got the opportunity. During the time when it remained vacant between Philip's murder and Helen's release from the hospital, Coneys said that he had survived off of cornmeal, as well as whatever canned goods and preserves were left in the basement. When the heat to the house was turned off, he nearly froze to death, and when the water was shut off, he resorted to drinking from the hot water heater before eventually making trips outside under the cover of darkness to grab snow to melt on his makeshift hot plate. According to Coneys, this was the only time that he ever left the house during that 10 months. Summer months were equally brutal in the confined space, and without any ventilation, it was both hot and the odors were powerful. This was something the detectives also noted, saying that searching the space after its discovery was almost unbearable. Still, Coneys chose to stay because he believed that he had left fingerprints behind everywhere at the crime scene, and that if he was arrested out on the street, it would only be a matter of time before investigators connected him to Philip's murder. He said that he spent his time reading, thinking, and listening to the radio that he had brought up from the basement. He was able to see thanks to a light that he had rigged up using some of the wires that passed through the attic. Understandably, details of Coneys' unbelievable crime and its aftermath quickly grabbed headlines nationwide at the time. While some continued to refer to him as the Moncrief Ghost, he soon came to be more widely known by a different name, the Spider-Man of Denver, or the Denver Spider-Man. The name began to circulate after one detective remarked that a man would have to be a spider to stand living where Coneys was found. In an interview, Coneys was reportedly asked whether he liked spiders, to which he replied, quote, "Sure, I like spiders. They're friendly. People are cruel." At his trial in October of 1942, Coneys claimed that he had no intention of robbing and killing Philip Peters, and that he was simply surprised when he had been caught at the icebox. However, a jury disagreed, and on Halloween, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. According to reports, following Coneys' conviction, he lived out the rest of his days quietly at the Colorado State Penitentiary in Canyon City. He died in 1967 at the age of 85, where he was described as a forgotten man of the penitentiary. Despite the quiet nature of Coneys' final years, one thing is clear. The story of the Denver Spider-Man continues to live on in the nightmares of those who will never forget the details of his chilling crime. On April 9th, 1984, a woman in southwest England named Maggie Backhouse left her home to run some errands. It was just supposed to be a short trip. Like most days, she and her husband Graham were busy at work on their 300-acre dairy farm. But that morning, Maggie needed to pick up some medication from the local vet for one of their cows. As she stepped out of their 2-story, yellow-painted farmhouse and headed for the garage, it was about 8:20 a.m. At first, she almost went to her own car before remembering that it was having mechanical issues, and instead, she got into the driver's seat of the family Volvo. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until Maggie tried to start the vehicle. The moment that she turned the key in the ignition, there was an ear-splitting sound, and everything around her was ripped to shreds. As police soon discovered, this terrifying explosion was no accident. Nor was it the only disturbing incident that had taken place here in recent days. Their investigation would lead them down a twisted path of murder and lies, one which would not only leave a dark stain on the history of a quiet village, but would forever force its residents to question how much anyone can truly know their neighbors. The tiny village of Horton, England, is by most accounts a place where very little happens. Located in the country's Cotswolds region, an area primarily known for tiny stone cottages and rolling green hills, it seems that Horton is quaint even by rural standards. Its 300-some-odd residents live almost entirely adjacent to the village's single main street, with houses close to the roadway and farmland on either side. While it's unclear if farming is still Horton's main industry, this certainly would have been the case several decades ago, when this story takes place. And suffice it to say, back then it was even less on the map, so to speak, than it is today. This was never a problem. In fact, according to an article we came across written by a resident at the time, author Derek Robinson, this was precisely how the people of Horton liked it. They were a close-knit community, the kind of place where strangers stuck out like a sore thumb, and local gossip traveled fast. Horton was also a place, as Robinson put it, that was always content to carry on with the way that things had always been, where anything that risked putting the village in the spotlight was automatically regarded with suspicion. It's for this reason that when Horton suddenly did make headlines in the spring of 1984, no one was prepared. What was even more startling was that the threat to the community didn't come from outside. It came from within. Before the spring of 1984, the Backhouses seemed like any other family in Horton. Like most of their neighbors, they were farmers and were the owners of a 300-acre plot of land called Wooden Hill Farm. Husband and wife, 43-year-old Graham and 37-year-old Maggie, lived in one house on the land with their 2 young children, 9-year-old Harry and 7-year-old Sophie, while Graham's 70-year-old mother Rita lived in a smaller bungalow on the property a short distance away. Strictly speaking, Rita still owned Wooden Hill Farm, though Graham and Maggie had taken over operations after the death of Graham's father in 1979. Before that, the husband and wife both had different careers, with Graham working as a hairdresser and Maggie working as a hotel receptionist. For the most part, it seemed like life in the countryside suited Graham and Maggie. Their work kept them busy, but they liked their neighbors and were reasonably social, with Maggie being especially well known for the charity work she did in the village, raising money for the Save the Children Fund. It seemed like their neighbors liked them too. That was, until they found themselves on the receiving end of a terrifying campaign of threatening letters and phone calls. Near the end of March of 1984, Graham Backhouse approached local Horton police officer Chris Beardwell with a concerning report. The 43-year-old said that for the last couple of weeks, he had been receiving unsettling and threatening communications from an anonymous person who seemed to have a grudge against him and his family. Graham explained that the whole thing had started when he received a letter accusing him of ruining the life of the sender's sister. The letter didn't provide many details, and as a result, Graham said that he had initially disregarded it, throwing it away. However, when an unknown man began calling his house and repeating the accusation, along with threats that he would pay for what he had done, Graham stated that he had started to grow concerned, especially when the man called again and threateningly inquired about the health of his wife and children. Officer Beardwell told Graham that he would look into the situation, but that, truthfully, there was very little he could do. He said that unfortunately there wasn't much to go on, especially since Graham didn't seem to have any idea who this unknown man was or what he was referring to in his letters and phone calls. On March 30th, Graham contacted Beardwell once again, saying that the threats against him and his family had gotten worse. A worker at Widdenhill Farm had come across the severed head of a lamb, which had been left impaled on a fence on the property. Next to it was a chilling note that simply said, quote, "You next." This time, Beardwell and other officers came out to the farm to conduct an investigation. They collected the disturbing evidence and had a look around, but weren't able to find anything else. Anyone thought to be near the scene at the time was interviewed, but unfortunately, it seemed that no one had actually witnessed the lamb's head and note being placed. Once again, police admitted that there was little that they could do. They would keep an eye on the property, but in the meantime, they advised Graham to try and secure his home in whatever way he could. For just over a week, things appeared to go back to normal. That was until the morning of April 9th, when Maggie Backhouse went to use the family Volvo, not realizing that she had just walked into a terrifying trap. The moment that Maggie Backhouse turned the key in the ignition of the Volvo that April morning, everything descended into chaos. There was a horrendous noise, her surroundings were ripped to pieces, and the pain she experienced was unimaginable. She didn't know it yet, but she had just triggered a crudely made pipe bomb that had been placed under the driver's seat. Though Maggie's legs had been badly injured in the blast, she managed to pull herself from the vehicle. Once free of the wreckage, she proceeded to crawl down the driveway screaming for help and was able to attract the attention of a couple of passing motorists. One of them alerted Graham, who had been in an adjacent farm building at the time of the explosion, and quickly ran to his wife's aid. Emergency workers arrived at the scene soon after, and Maggie was rushed to the hospital. Once there, she would undergo at least 2 surgeries for the severe injuries she had sustained. At least a pound of pellets and shrapnel needed to be removed from her legs and lower back, and she would receive several skin grafts, but ultimately she would survive. Back at the crime scene, authorities discovered the reason for Maggie's miraculous survival. Once the bomb squad had done a thorough sweep to make sure there were no other explosive devices present, detectives were able to conduct a thorough examination of the Volvo and learned that whoever had created and planted the bomb hadn't done a very good job. For starters, the explosive device was crudely made, consisting of a small section of pipe that had been filled with shotgun pellets and gunpowder. Though it was powerful, it hadn't been well assembled. The point of failure had actually happened on one of the ends of the device rather than in the middle of the pipe, meaning that the explosion had been far more directional than intended. Picture something more like a cannon rather than an actual bomb. Furthermore, because the device had been placed underneath the driver's seat, which apparently was well constructed, it meant that a lot of the impact was either absorbed or redirected before it actually hit Maggie. Of course, police immediately had their doubts as to whether Maggie Backhouse was the intended target of the attack. Assuming this was the work of the same person who had been sending the threats, they reasoned it was more likely that Graham was the person they were after, especially since the Volvo where the explosives had been placed was primarily driven by him. This theory was all but confirmed in the eyes of investigators when another threatening letter was discovered at Widdenhill Farm the same day as the car bombing. It read, quote, "Came tice, but the pigs were about. See you soon." The note seemed to suggest that the perpetrator had come to the scene again, but had been driven away by the police presence. It also chillingly appeared to show that whoever this person was, their business with Graham and his family wasn't finished yet. Needless to say, news of the attack on Maggie Backhouse traveled quickly in Horton. Though residents were happy to hear that she had survived, this in and of itself was of little comfort to many of them, especially when reports were released detailing the series of disturbing threats against her husband and the family that had preceded the incident. For a village that had always seen outsiders as the primary danger to their way of life, this was particularly hard to come to grips with. This crime appeared to be personal in nature, meaning that the culprit was likely someone living in their midst. As Maggie recovered in the hospital, the rest of the Backhouse family was placed under police guard. Meanwhile, authorities continued their investigation, part of which included interviewing nearly everyone in Horton about the case. While in reality this was to try and generate as many leads as possible, it had the unintended consequence of reinforcing in many residents' minds that none of their friends and neighbors were above suspicion. Detectives were hoping that witnesses might be able to help direct the case, because truthfully there was little else to go on. The only real evidence they had so far were the remnants of the explosive device itself, as well as the 2 threatening letters left at Widdenhill Farm before and after the attack. Upon closer inspection, investigators discovered the "You Next" note had an imprint on it, seemingly left behind from the pressure of a pen or pencil that had written on another piece of paper on top of it. The imprint itself was fairly unique and appeared to be some sort of circular doodle, though for the time being, it wasn't of much use to police. Hoping to get some sense of direction, detectives once again turned to Graham Backhouse, asking him if there was anyone at all he could think of who might have a grudge against him. This time, the 43-year-old offered up new information. Graham explained that he hadn't wanted to admit it before, but he had been involved in numerous extramarital affairs. The majority of these, he said, had just been one-offs, but he claimed there were at least 2 that were different. There was a 25-year-old woman named Jillian, who was the daughter of a local sheep farmer. And there was the wife of one of his best friends, David Hodkinson, who he had been intimate with several times. Police therefore theorized that someone connected to the women might have had a motive to want Graham dead. As it turned out, David was a former quarry worker who had both experience with and access to explosives. Even more interestingly, he now worked as an electrician, and one of his specialties happened to be working with electronics and wiring within cars. While there was little question that David had the knowledge required to carry out the attack that had injured Maggie, when police did some further digging into him, they immediately encountered a problem. At the time of the explosion, David had been on vacation and had been out of the country for several days. Though not as conclusive, detectives soon hit a wall with the other name Graham provided as well. Jillian flat out denied ever having an affair with the 43-year-old, and there didn't seem to be any other evidence suggesting she or anyone connected to her was involved with the case. With that, police seemingly hit another dead end. As days dragged on, authorities weren't the only ones frustrated by the lack of progress in the investigation. Many residents in Horton were growing increasingly worried that whoever had planted the car bomb might get away with it, making them question if they could ever really feel safe in their community again. After 9 days of being under police guard, Graham, too, appeared to be feeling the strain. He told officers that they no longer needed to keep a 24-hour presence at the property, as he and his family needed to at least try to return to their normal routine. He opted instead for an alarm button to be installed in his 2-story farmhouse. The button would connect directly with the local police station and could be used to immediately alert them if something had happened. Well, less than 2 weeks later, that button would be pressed. It was the beginning of a horrifying twist in the investigation that no one saw coming. At around 8:25 p.m. on April 30th, residents of Horton were once again set on edge by the sounds of sirens racing down the main road. As police cars whipped past the village hall, where an annual committee meeting was being held that night, the atmosphere immediately grew tense. According to a newspaper article from the time, most of those in attendance simply sat there helplessly, and the few that could muster words soon said what everyone was thinking. I hope to God they are not going to Graham's farm again. Though no one wanted to believe it, this is precisely where police were headed. Just a few minutes earlier, the emergency alarm button that authorities had installed in the Backhouse home had been activated. When officers arrived at Widdenhill Farm, they quickly encountered a grisly scene. There was blood all over the kitchen floor of the family's 2-story farmhouse, and chairs and other furniture were overturned. Graham was alive, but bleeding badly from 2 deep cut wounds to his face and chest. At the end of a hallway at the bottom of the stairs, another man was lying on the floor. He had 2 gunshot wounds to his chest and was holding a red Stanley utility knife in his right hand. He was dead. The deceased man was almost immediately identified as 63-year-old Colin Bedale Taylor, a neighbor of the Backhouses who lived just 200 yards away from Wittenhill Farm. After being taken to a hospital, Graham was treated for his injuries. His first cut wound began on his upper chest, traveling diagonally down and partially around the lower part of his torso, while his second wound began on the left side of his face near his ear and went across to just underneath his lower lip. The 2 injuries required a total of more than 50 stitches, with doctors saying that the 43-year-old would likely have visible scars for the rest of his life. During a subsequent interview at the hospital, Graham told police that earlier that evening, he had met with his neighbor, Colin, at his request. He said that Colin, who was known locally as a handyman, had come over under the guise of looking at some furniture. However, at some point, things had taken a violent turn. Graham said that Colin had started acting strangely and began accusing him of crazy things, including being responsible for the death of his 19-year-old son 2 years earlier. When Graham pushed back, he claimed Colin had admitted to being behind the car bomb that had nearly killed Maggie, as well as the other threatening phone calls and letters. He then pulled out the utility knife and attacked, saying that it was God's will for him to die. Graham said that after being slashed out with the knife, he had managed to run to the place where he kept his shotgun, firing the 2 shots that had killed Colin. For residents of Horton, news of a second violent incident at Wittenhill Farm was almost too much to handle, especially when media outlets began to release details about Colin Bedale Taylor's alleged involvement in both crimes. While the 63-year-old had something of a reputation amongst locals for being a bit eccentric, no one ever suspected that he would have been capable of something like this. He and his wife, Margaret, had lived in Horton for over 20 years and had raised their 4 children there and had been actively involved in community life. In all that time, there hadn't been a single warning sign. Still, as more information came out, some people started to wonder. It turned out that Colin's initials had been scratched into the handle of the utility knife used in the attack. And when a search of his and Margaret's house was carried out, a section of pipe that was a match to the one used in the April 9th car bombing was found lying on their property. It had been cut at the exact angle as the piece of the explosive device that had been recovered from the crime scene. Soon, local gossip and other details about Colin and his family made its way into the newspapers. It was well known that the death of his son Digby in a car accident in 1982 had hit Colin particularly hard. And it was reported that he had been treated for depression after being forced into early retirement from his engineering job. Some also remembered that Colin had been involved in an ongoing land dispute with Graham Backhouse that at times had turned into shouting matches. People wondered, could all of these things added up to the point where Colin was pushed over the edge? For nearly 2 weeks, the rumors and suspicion swirled. That was, until a shocking revelation was made by investigators. On the night of May 12, 1984, police made one final trip to Wittenhill Farm. Only this time, it wasn't to respond to any kind of incident. It was to arrest the person truly responsible for all of the horrific things that had happened there up until that point. And that person was Graham Backhouse. It turned out that Graham's evil plan had started at least as far back as November of 1983, when the 43-year-old had been warned about his dire financial situation during a meeting with his accountant. Ever since taking over from his father, Graham had been struggling to keep Wittenhill Farm afloat, with 2 back-to-back years of crop failures hitting him pretty hard. When Graham met with his accountant, he stated he wanted to switch from growing crops to focusing more on raising cattle, but he was told that he already owed too much money to take on more debt. He was in the hole more than £50,000, and in order to pay for the cattle he wanted, plus all of the associated costs, he would need to come up with nearly twice that amount. Graham first tried to raise the money by selling off some of Wittenhill's farmland, though only a couple of small parcels sold. A larger chunk that was put up for auction a couple months later didn't generate any interest. By the spring of 1984, Graham's debts had crept up to over £70,000. And it was at this point he decided he would now get his hands on the money he wanted by any means necessary. Knowing that he already had a £50,000 life insurance policy on his wife Maggie, in March of 1984, Graham took out a second policy for the same amount. Just days later, he began to orchestrate the fake terror campaign against himself and his family, sending the letters that he later turned over to police. When this initially failed to garner enough attention, he upped the ante, planting the severed lamb's head with the "You Next" note. Once he felt that police were convinced enough by the fake threats, he created and planted the car bomb on April 9th and made sure that Maggie used his vehicle. Fortunately, Graham wasn't skilled or experienced with explosives, and his homemade device failed to kill his wife as he intended. While Graham knew this meant that he would no longer get the money he was after, he quickly found he had bigger problems to deal with, namely making sure that police didn't find out he was the one responsible for the crime. At first, Graham planned to pin the bombing on his friend David Hodkinson. He figured that David would make a good suspect because of the affair that he had had with his wife and because of David's experience with explosives and electrical wiring. However, when Graham tried to lure David over to his house following the car bombing, David didn't take the bait. As a result, Graham was forced to change plans and turned his attention to his neighbor, Colin Bedale Taylor. After asking Colin to come over to look at some furniture he was thinking about restoring, Graham shot and killed Colin, then staged the scene to look like an attack. This included inflicting the deep cut wounds to his own face and chest to sell police on his claim of self-defense. As added measures, Graham carved Colin's initials into the utility knife he used to injure himself before placing it in his hand and dumped part of the pipe he had used to make the car bomb on Colin's property. In other words, Graham Backhouse nearly killed his own wife, then murdered his innocent neighbor, all for £100,000 of insurance money that, by this time, he knew he would never receive. When prosecutors laid out these same details at a trial in January of 1985, the public was stunned. It wasn't just a narrative that authorities relied on, though. By this time, they had found plenty of evidence to back their story up. For starters, there were the financial statements confirming all of Graham's debts, as well as the paperwork showing that he had taken out that second insurance policy just days before going to police about the fabricated threats. Then there was the blood evidence at the scene of the shooting. Though Graham claimed that Colin had chased him through the house, all of the blood drops on the kitchen floor were nearly perfect circles, much more consistent with someone who was standing still than someone who was running. Likewise, though Graham claimed that he had been slashed by Colin before grabbing his gun, there was no blood found on the weapon. Graham's injuries were also inconsistent with the statements he gave to police. Experts concluded that due to how long the slash mark was on Graham's chest and the way it went around his torso, the only way another person could have done it is if they had been holding him from behind. Graham had always insisted that Colin had attacked him while they were face-to-face. Even if Graham had lied about this for some reason, experts concluded there were other aspects to the wound suggesting that they were almost certainly self-inflicted. The depth of the cuts were more consistent with someone pulling towards themselves. This didn't make sense because if Graham had been attacked, he should have been instinctively pulling away. To top it all off, he had no defensive wounds. Even Colin's so-called initials on the utility knife ended up being something that worked to the advantage of prosecutors. Friends and family members of his stated that Colin was extremely particular about his tools and never would have carved his initials into one of them like that. To back this up, they pointed to the more than 500 tools he had in his home, not a single one of which had his initials on them. Despite all of the evidence against him, Graham Backhouse insisted that he was not responsible for anything that had happened. He instead maintained his innocence, claiming that he loved his wife and family, while his defense team spent several days of the trial dragging Colin's name through the mud. Like the town gossip that had come before it, this consisted mostly of unfounded speculation about Colin's mental health. At one point, a psychiatrist came in and testified that he might have been suffering from violent paranoid delusions. Graham continued to stick to his not guilty pleas, even after 2 letters that he had tried to smuggle out of his jail cell were intercepted by police. In one of these letters, meant for his wife Maggie, Graham reportedly pleaded with her to try and help him fabricate new evidence against Colin Bedale Taylor. On February 18th, 1985, Graham Backhouse was found guilty of murder and attempted murder and was handed 2 life sentences. In a statement during the proceedings, the judge in the case, Justice Stuart Smith, called Graham an evil and devious man, saying, quote, "Not content with trying to kill a wife who, according to your own evidence, loved you and had done you no wrong, you then set about cold-bloodedly to plot and kill your neighbor who had never done you any harm and who you barely knew." Sadly, for one of the largest victims of this whole ordeal, Maggie Backhouse, it appears things didn't get any easier once the trial was over. After finally recovering from her injuries and coming to terms with what her husband had done, she was then embroiled in a legal battle over the fate of Wooden Hill Farm. Maggie had kept the farm running for the 10 months between Graham's arrest and his conviction. However, after his sentencing, the property was placed in a trust. Though Maggie wanted to stay at the farm that she and her children had come to think of as home, after several months it was sold and they were forced to leave. Her divorce from Graham was finalized in the spring of 1986. Graham himself would die of a heart attack in prison in 1994 at the age of 53, after serving 10 years in prison.
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.